Good evening and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Tonight we have 5 stories that, on the surface, look unconnected: a nuclear exclusion zone still caught in crossfire, a crackdown on Ramadan lights in occupied Jerusalem, a medical breakthrough in Japan, a British elite sex scandal spreading to new names, and African men being trafficked to a war they didn't start. But stay with us, because by the end of this hour, you'll see the thread that ties every single one of them together.
I'm Maya Clarity, and tonight we are not pulling punches. We are talking about the militarization of sacred sites, the commodification of desperate human lives, the suppression of cultural identity under occupation, and the uncomfortable truth about who holds power in Western governments and who they really serve. This is Truth Report, and we report what others won't.
Let's begin with what may be the most dangerous story on the planet right now, not in terms of scale, but in terms of the existential risk it represents. Ukraine's Chernobyl exclusion zone, the site of the worst nuclear disaster in recorded human history, remains, as Al Jazeera's Nils Adler has documented firsthand, an active part of a war zone. In 2026, nearly 2 years into the full-scale invasion, the zone has not been stabilized, demilitarized, or protected in any meaningful international legal sense.
For viewers who need the background, in April 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine exploded. The explosion released radiation estimated at 400 times the fallout from the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. An exclusion zone of roughly 30 kilometers was established around the plant. That zone has never been fully safe, it won't be for thousands of years. And now Russian and Ukrainian forces have both operated within and around that zone since the earliest days of the 2022 invasion.
Al Jazeera's Nils Adler has reported from inside the exclusion zone, and what he found is deeply troubling. Military activity in and around Chernobyl is not a hypothetical, it is an ongoing reality. Russian forces famously occupied the Chernobyl facility in the opening days of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. They dug trenches in the highly contaminated Red Forest. They reportedly exposed their own soldiers to dangerous radiation levels. They held Ukrainian staff at the plant hostage for weeks. And when they withdrew in late March 2022, the crisis didn't end, it metastasized.
What doesn't get reported often enough is that the Chernobyl zone is not just a monument to Cold War failure. It is an active site. The new safe confinement structure, that enormous steel arch built to contain the original sarcophagus over Reactor 4, requires constant maintenance, monitoring, and power. During the Russian occupation, that maintenance was interrupted. External power to the plant was cut. Emergency diesel generators were running. The International Atomic Energy Agency issued warnings. And the world mostly moved on to the next headline.
And here's the geopolitical dimension that rarely gets examined: the Chernobyl zone sits just 16 kilometers from the Belarusian border. Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, has been a staging ground for Russian military operations since the invasion began. That means the exclusion zone is sandwiched between an active war front and a country functioning as a Russian military proxy. There are no international peacekeepers. There is no protected status under current international law that has been meaningfully enforced.
The 1954 Hague Convention and its 1999 Second Protocol established protections for cultural and historical sites during armed conflict. There are arguments, and strong ones, that a nuclear exclusion zone should receive equivalent or greater protection under international humanitarian law. But Russia is not a signatory to the Second Protocol, and enforcement mechanisms for any international law in this conflict have proven almost entirely symbolic.
What Al Jazeera's reporting underscores is something that should be front-page news every single day: we are gambling with nuclear catastrophe in a live war zone, and the international community, the United Nations Security Council, NATO, the IAEA, has failed to create any meaningful protective framework. The IAEA has observers at Ukrainian nuclear sites, including Zaporizhia, but their presence is observational, not protective. They can document incidents. They cannot stop them.
And the human cost extends beyond radiation risk. The workers who maintain the Chernobyl facility, the engineers, the security personnel, the scientists monitoring the sarcophagus, these are Ukrainians living and working in a war zone. They have continued their duties under occupation, under bombardment, under conditions that would cause most people to simply walk away. Their story is not being told loudly enough. Al Jazeera's Adler is one of the few journalists who has gone in. We need more.
The deeper implication here is about what war does to infrastructure that civilization depends on. Chernobyl is an extreme example, but the pattern repeats. The Kakhovka Dam was destroyed in June 2023, flooding vast agricultural regions. The Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged, still without full public accountability. Energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure, these are being targeted or caught in conflict with consequences that outlast any ceasefire. And the world is not treating that reality with the seriousness it deserves.
Now let's move from one occupied territory to another. From the radioactive ruins of Soviet-era Ukraine to the ancient streets of Jerusalem, we turn to a story that is, on its surface, about lights and decorations, but is, in reality, about the systematic erasure of Palestinian cultural life under Israeli military administration. Middle East Eye is reporting that Israel has banned Ramadan decorations in Jerusalem. Let that sink in. Ramadan, the holiest month in the Islamic calendar, observed by nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide, and Jerusalem, one of the holiest cities in Islam, and Palestinian residents cannot hang their traditional lights.
Let's be precise about what this means and what it doesn't, because precision matters in this story. The ban, as reported by Middle East Eye, targets public Ramadan decorations, the lanterns, the lights, the crescent moon symbols that Palestinian families and shopkeepers traditionally display during the holy month. Israeli authorities have in the past used a range of justifications for such restrictions, from security concerns to permit requirements that are effectively impossible to obtain. The headline quote from a Palestinian resident says it simply, they are missing the beauty.
That phrase, missing the beauty, is doing enormous work. It captures something that dry legal or security analysis cannot. Ramadan decorations are not a security threat. They are the visual expression of a community's religious and cultural identity. And that identity, in East Jerusalem, is under coordinated and documented pressure. Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem exist in a legal limbo. They are not Israeli citizens, they are not residents of a recognized Palestinian state, they hold a status of permanent residency that can be revoked. And they live under Israeli municipal authority that has routinely favored Jewish-Israeli development over Palestinian presence.
The context here is critical, and Middle East Eye, to its credit, situates this story within that broader context. East Jerusalem was annexed by Israel following the 1967 war, an annexation not recognized by the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, or any major international body as legal under international law. The international consensus, codified in multiple UN Security Council resolutions, is that East Jerusalem is occupied territory and its final status must be determined through negotiation. Israel's domestic law treats it as sovereign Israeli territory. That contradiction is the source of nearly every conflict that occurs in the city streets.
And that contradiction has material consequences. Ramadan in Jerusalem is not just a religious observance, it is an economic lifeline for Palestinian shopkeepers in the Old City, in the Muslim Quarter, around the Damascus Gate area. Tourism, local commerce, community gathering, all of these are concentrated during Ramadan. A ban on decorations is not a neutral act. It is an economic and cultural suppression dressed up in administrative language.
We also need to name what is happening in the broader regional context. This ban is being reported in February 2026, in the shadow of an ongoing conflict in Gaza that has reshaped the entire political landscape. The treatment of Palestinians in Jerusalem cannot be separated from the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the refugee camps of Lebanon and Jordan. These are not separate populations with separate political destinies, they are part of a single people whose dispossession has been ongoing since 1948.
And for those who will immediately ask about balance, where is the equivalent cultural suppression by Palestinian authorities? The answer requires geographic honesty. Palestinian authorities do not govern Jerusalem. They do not have the power to ban Israeli cultural expression in the city. The power relationship here is entirely asymmetric. Israel holds administrative, military, and police control over East Jerusalem. The asymmetry of power is the context. Without it, you're not reporting news, you're producing propaganda.
There is also a legal dimension worth examining carefully. Freedom of religion and religious cultural expression are protected under international human rights law, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Israel is a signatory. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief has previously issued statements regarding restrictions on Muslim religious practice in Jerusalem. These are not fringe observations, they are documented by international legal bodies. The ban on Ramadan decorations is not just an indignity. It is arguably a violation of binding international legal obligations.
Now, let's take a turn to a story that, at first glance, seems entirely removed from conflict zones and occupation politics. But bear with us, because the implications of what Japan announced this week are profound, and they connect back to the stories we've already told in ways that matter. The South China Morning Post is reporting that Japan's Health Ministry panel has approved the commercialization of 2 regenerative medicine products derived from induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS cells, the first such approvals in the world.
Let's unpack what this actually means for people who haven't followed the science. Induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells, were pioneered by Japanese scientist Shinya Yamanaka, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2012 for the discovery. The breakthrough was this: Yamanaka's team discovered that ordinary adult cells, skin cells, for instance, could be reprogrammed back to a stem cell-like state, capable of developing into virtually any cell type in the body. This was revolutionary because it bypassed the ethical controversies surrounding embryonic stem cell research while offering equivalent or greater therapeutic potential.
The 2 drugs approved by Japan's Health Ministry panel represent the first commercial translation of that laboratory breakthrough into actual treatments for patients. The first is ReHeart, developed by CureUps, a startup originating from Osaka University. ReHeart is designed for patients with severe heart failure stemming from ischemic cardiomyopathy, that's heart failure caused by blocked arteries cutting off blood supply to the heart muscle. The second drug is Amchepry, developed by Sumitomo Pharma and Rakthera, targeting Parkinson's disease, the progressive neurological disorder that affects motor function and afflicts tens of millions of people globally.
The significance here cannot be overstated. These are not incremental improvements to existing treatments. These are, potentially, regenerative treatments, meaning they don't just manage symptoms or slow progression, they use laboratory-grown cells derived from iPS technology to repair or replace damaged tissue. ReHeart would provide heart muscle cells to replace those destroyed by ischemic damage. Amchepry targets the dopamine-producing neurons in the brain that Parkinson's disease destroys. If the efficacy data holds up in broader clinical use, we are looking at a genuine paradigm shift in how medicine approaches some of the most devastating chronic conditions in the world.
Japan's approval pathway for regenerative medicine is worth examining as a policy model. After Yamanaka's Nobel Prize, Japan moved with unusual speed to create a regulatory framework specifically designed to accelerate the clinical translation of regenerative medicine products. The Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine, passed in 2014, created a conditional approval system that allows regenerative medicines to reach patients earlier, with post-market surveillance requirements. This is a departure from the standard randomized controlled trial pathway that governs most pharmaceutical approvals in the US and Europe.
That regulatory flexibility is genuinely controversial among scientists and ethicists. Some researchers argue Japan's framework prioritizes speed over evidence, that conditional approvals based on smaller, shorter trials risk putting patients on treatments whose long-term efficacy and safety profiles are not yet established. Others argue that for patients with severe heart failure or advanced Parkinson's disease, waiting for decades of trial data while people die is its own ethical failure. This tension, between rigorous evidence standards and the urgent needs of dying patients, is not unique to Japan, but Japan has resolved it more aggressively in favor of speed than most developed countries.
There's also a geopolitical dimension here that rarely gets discussed when science stories are reported. Japan's leadership in iPS cell technology and regenerative medicine is not accidental, it is the product of sustained, strategic government investment in basic and translational research over decades. The contrast with other countries' research funding trajectories is stark. And in a world where biotechnology leadership is increasingly understood as a national security and economic competitiveness issue, alongside AI, semiconductor manufacturing, and energy technology, Japan's iPS cell success represents a significant strategic asset.
The connection to the conflict stories we've been covering is, at first, not obvious. But consider, we just reported on a war zone that has endangered nuclear infrastructure whose failure could render portions of Ukraine uninhabitable for generations. We reported on a population in occupied Jerusalem being denied cultural expression, living under conditions of chronic stress, inadequate healthcare access, and periodic violence. The fruits of Japan's medical breakthrough, regenerative therapies for heart disease and Parkinson's, are most needed by aging, stressed, conflict-affected populations. But access to cutting-edge medicine is not distributed according to need. It follows the geography of wealth and power.
Who will have access to ReHeart and Amchepry? Not the people of Gaza. Not the elderly Ukrainians whose healthcare system has been shattered by 2 years of full-scale war. Not the Kenyans we're about to discuss, who are being lured into a conflict thousands of miles from home. Medical breakthroughs do not exist in a political vacuum. The question of who benefits from science is always, ultimately, a political question.
Speaking of who benefits and who bears the cost, let's go to London, where the political establishment is experiencing what can only be described as a slow-motion reckoning with its own corruption. Consortium News and the investigative outlet Declassified UK are reporting on a story with implications that reach from Buckingham Palace to the corridors of Westminster, with Prince Andrew now arrested in connection with what is described as a probe linked to the Jeffrey Epstein network. Attention has now turned to Peter Mandelson, Labour grandee, former European Trade Commissioner, and newly appointed British ambassador to the United States.
The reporting by Martin Williams for Declassified UK details that Mandelson is facing scrutiny for conduct that echoes the concerns around Andrew. Specifically, the investigation appears to center on Mandelson's continued ties, both to Epstein associates and, separately, to Conservative Party figures, long after his own friendship with Jeffrey Epstein had become publicly known. That friendship, which Mandelson has acknowledged, included at least one documented stay at Epstein's New York property after Epstein's 2008 sex offender conviction in Florida.
Let's be clear about what we know and what remains under investigation. Prince Andrew's arrest, a significant development given royal protections he has historically enjoyed, signals a shift in the legal and political climate in Britain. The Jeffrey Epstein network was not simply a story about one American financier's personal crimes. It was, as years of investigative journalism have documented, a network that connected powerful men across finance, politics, royalty, academia, and media in the United States, United Kingdom, and elsewhere. The full extent of that network's activities has never been subjected to a complete, public, independent legal reckoning.
Mandelson's situation is complicated by multiple overlapping dimensions. First, there is the Epstein connection itself, the question of what Mandelson knew, when he knew it, and whether his continued association with Epstein or Epstein's network constituted something legally or ethically actionable. Second, there is the Tory connection that Declassified UK's reporting highlights, the question of whether Mandelson, who is a senior Labour figure, maintained substantive relationships with Conservative politicians and interests in ways that complicate his public political identity. Third, there is his current role as UK ambassador to the United States at a moment of acute diplomatic sensitivity.
That third dimension is the one that should concern the British public most urgently. An ambassador represents their country's interests in dealings with a foreign government. Ambassador Mandelson is currently the face of Britain in Washington at a moment when the US-UK relationship is being actively renegotiated, trade agreements, intelligence sharing, defense commitments, NATO contributions. If Mandelson is simultaneously under investigation for conduct connected to the Epstein network, the leverage that creates, the vulnerability it represents, in diplomatic negotiations is not a theoretical concern. It is a practical national security question.
The Declassified UK reporting also surfaces the question of Mandelson's connections to Israeli interests, framed in the headline as his conduct of unofficial diplomacy with Israel on behalf of persons or interests that are not fully specified in the available reporting. This is significant because informal, off-the-books diplomatic contact between senior political figures and foreign governments raises serious questions about who is actually setting policy and through what channels. Formal diplomatic channels exist for good reasons, they create accountability, records, and legal clarity. Unofficial back channels serve different purposes, and those purposes are not always consistent with the interests of the public those politicians nominally serve.
The broader pattern here, and we'll return to this in our synthesis, is about the relationship between elite networks, formal political power, and accountability. Mandelson is not an isolated case. He is a symptom of a system in which senior political figures operate across formal and informal networks simultaneously, in which associations with deeply problematic individuals are treated as a matter of personal discretion rather than public accountability, and in which the gap between the political class's stated values and their actual conduct is vast and largely unexamined by mainstream media.
Now to our final story tonight, and it is one that connects directly back to the Ukraine conflict we opened with, but from an angle that most Western coverage entirely ignores. The Guardian is reporting on an intelligence finding presented to Kenya's parliament. More than 1,000 Kenyan nationals have been lured to fight for Russia in the Ukraine war. The majority leader of Kenya's National Assembly, Kimani Ichung'wah, told Parliament that rogue recruitment agencies and individuals in Kenya are responsible for what the intelligence report describes as a systematic Russian operation to recruit African men to the frontline.
More than 1,000 people. Let that number land. 1,000 Kenyans, primarily young men, recruited, the intelligence report's language is lured, which implies deception, to fight in a conflict in Eastern Europe that has no direct relationship to Kenya's national interests, security, or territorial concerns. These are not mercenaries in the classic sense of highly paid military professionals choosing high-risk work for high rewards. The reporting pattern in similar cases from other African countries, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, has consistently shown that men are recruited with promises of legitimate work or high wages, and find themselves at the front before fully understanding what they've signed up for.
The scale of Russian recruitment of African nationals deserves serious investigative attention that it has not received. Russia's Wagner Group, now formally restructured following the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin but still operationally active under different organizational structures, has operated across Africa for years, in the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Libya, in Burkina Faso, in Sudan. Wagner's African operations have combined mercenary combat services to sitting governments with resource extraction deals, gold, diamonds, timber, that effectively pay for military services with access to natural resources. This has been documented by the UN panel of experts, by investigative journalists at outlets including The Sentry and All Eyes on Wagner, and by human rights organizations.
The recruitment of Kenyans to fight in Ukraine represents an extension of that model, but with a critical difference. In Wagner's African operations, African recruits were fighting on African soil, in African conflicts, for various factions. The Kenyan recruits are being taken out of Africa entirely and placed on a European frontline thousands of kilometers from home. The geographic and cultural dislocation involved, the language barriers, the climate, the total unfamiliarity of the terrain, makes the vulnerability of these recruits even more acute. And their deaths, when they occur, are less likely to be investigated, publicized, or acknowledged by either the Russian military or anyone else.
Kenya's intelligence services apparently have enough information to bring this to Parliament, which means they have identified recruitment networks, possibly specific agencies or individuals, and have some understanding of the scale of the operation. That raises immediate questions. What is the Kenyan government doing to interdict these networks? Are there prosecutions underway? What is the legal framework in Kenya for prosecuting individuals who recruit citizens into foreign military service, particularly under false pretenses? And what diplomatic pressure, if any, has Kenya brought to bear on Russia?
There's also the question of what this says about the global economics of the Ukraine war. Russia has taken enormous casualties in the conflict. Estimates from Western intelligence agencies have placed Russian military casualties, killed and wounded, in the hundreds of thousands. Russia has responded with mobilization of its own citizens, with recruitment from Russian prisons, with deployment of North Korean troops as documented by South Korean and U.S. intelligence, and now, apparently, with systematic recruitment of men from African countries. The war's human cost is being distributed globally in ways that are deeply inequitable and largely invisible to Western audiences.
That inequity is not accidental. It is a feature, not a bug, of how powerful states conduct wars. When your own population's tolerance for casualties is limited, when your society can absorb only so much loss before political pressure to end the conflict becomes overwhelming, you find other populations to bear the cost. Russia is doing this explicitly. But the West has historically done the same thing in different ways, through proxy armies, through military aid that keeps other people's soldiers fighting, through economic conditions that make military service the only viable option for young men in developing countries.
And now let's pull back and look at what tonight's 5 stories, taken together, tell us about the world we are living in. We have a nuclear exclusion zone in an active war zone, an environmental and existential risk being normalized because no powerful actor has sufficient incentive to stop the war or protect the site. We have Palestinian cultural expression being systematically suppressed in a city that 3 of the world's major religions regard as sacred, an occupation that has lasted nearly 60 years and which the international community continues to describe as temporary. We have a medical breakthrough that could transform the treatment of heart disease and Parkinson's, but whose benefits will flow to the wealthy nations with functioning healthcare systems and the resources to pay for cutting-edge therapies.
We have a senior British politician under investigation for his connections to the Jeffrey Epstein network, a network whose full dimensions remain deliberately obscured, simultaneously serving as his country's ambassador to a nuclear-armed superpower at a moment of critical diplomatic negotiation. And we have more than 1,000 men from Kenya being trafficked, in effect, to a European war front by Russian recruitment networks operating openly enough that a country's intelligence service can count them and present the findings to Parliament.
The thread that connects all 5 stories is this: power protects itself. Nuclear infrastructure in a war zone goes unprotected because the powerful actors involved, Russia, the Western Alliance, Ukraine, each calculate that the costs of a genuine protective framework outweigh the benefits they would receive. Palestinian cultural life is suppressed because Israel has military, economic, and diplomatic cover from the most powerful country on earth, the United States, and because the international legal system has no effective enforcement mechanism when a U.S. ally is the violator.
Medical breakthroughs flow toward those who can pay because pharmaceutical and biotech development is structured as a market function, not a public health function. Elite networks, Epstein, Mandelson, Andrew, and the many powerful figures whose names we still don't know, persist precisely because the legal systems and political accountability mechanisms that are supposed to constrain them are staffed and shaped by people who belong to those same networks. And African men end up on a European frontline because global economic inequality makes them recruitable, makes desperation a resource that powerful states can exploit.
The Chernobyl zone will remain radioactive for 10,000 years. The occupation of East Jerusalem has lasted nearly 60 years and shows no sign of ending. The Epstein network has been partially exposed but not dismantled. The recruitment of African men into foreign wars will continue as long as the economic conditions that make them vulnerable are left unchanged. These are not natural disasters. They are political choices, choices made by powerful actors who bear none of the consequences.
What can audiences do with this information? The first thing, and this is not a small thing, is to refuse to be numb. The volume of crisis in the world today is deliberately overwhelming. When everything is a catastrophe, nothing is. The political and media environments that generate constant noise are, whether intentionally or not, producing exactly the numbing effect that serves power. Stay with the specific. The Kenyan man who was told he was going to construction work in Russia and ended up in a trench in Zaporizhia. The Palestinian shopkeeper who cannot hang his Ramadan lantern. The Ukrainian engineer maintaining a radioactive tomb while artillery fires nearby. These are real people. Hold their reality.
The second thing is to demand accountability from the institutions that are supposed to provide it but aren't. The IAEA should be issuing daily public updates on Chernobyl's status. The United Nations Human Rights Council should be hearing cases on Jerusalem's Ramadan ban as a violation of international covenants. The British Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee should be holding public hearings on Peter Mandelson's fitness to serve as ambassador while under investigation. The Kenyan government should be prosecuting recruitment networks and presenting Russia with a formal diplomatic protest. These are not radical demands. They are the minimum that accountability looks like.
And the third thing, perhaps the most important, is to support the journalists who are doing the work. Al Jazeera's Nils Adler going into the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Middle East Eyes reporters in Jerusalem during Ramadan. The Guardian's team covering Kenya's parliament intelligence briefings. Martin Williams and Declassified UK, one of the few outlets consistently covering the connections between British elite networks, foreign policy, and accountability failures. Investigative journalism requires resources, courage, and institutional support. In an era of media consolidation and advertising revenue collapse, those resources are under constant pressure. The news you are watching right now exists because someone believed the truth was worth pursuing.
That is what Truth Report is. Not entertainment. Not the performance of outrage. Not both sides balance that pretends power differentials don't exist. Journalism in pursuit of truth, with sources, with context, with the willingness to say directly, this is wrong, this is who is responsible, and this is what accountability would look like.
Tonight we covered a nuclear war zone that the world is ignoring. A cultural crackdown in an occupied city that the world calls temporary, a medical breakthrough that will not reach those who need it most, a political scandal in Britain that implicates the highest levels of the establishment, and the trafficking of African men into a European war. In every one of these stories, power is operating without accountability. In every one of these stories, ordinary people are bearing costs that powerful actors have offloaded onto them. And in every one of these stories, the truth is available, if you're willing to look.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. We'll be back tomorrow. Stay informed. Stay critical. Stay awake.
Good night.